Hi, I'm Debbie Ingram, and this is Town Meeting TV's Under the Dome series. I'm hosting a special series called Affordability in Vermont, and we're focusing on taxes, income, and housing costs. Today, my guest is Kevin Chu, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont Futures Project. And thank you, Kevin, for being with me.
Debbie, thank you for having me.
Great. And so the Vermont Futures Project, for people who don't know, is it's an organization that's done an analysis of Vermont's labor force and economic growth potential and has come up with an economic plan. And so today we'll only be able to go over the economic plan in sort of broad strokes, but we hope that we pique viewers' interest so that they'll take a closer look. So why don't we dive right in, and could you first tell us what was the process that you used to examine Vermont's current economic situation and anticipated future?
Certainly. So the process was a mix of both quantitative and qualitative research, so numbers and narrative, and it involved a process of traveling around Vermont, engaging with the public. Over the past 2 years, I've spoken with over 5,000 Vermonters across all 14 counties. And it was a process to both bring information out to communities, but also to learn from Vermonters, to ask them what are the challenges that they're facing, what are the opportunities that they see, and more importantly, what are their hopes, dreams, and ambitions for the future of Vermont. When we look at the quantitative data, it's really helpful insofar that it tells us what might happen if we choose to do nothing. That's where data is helpful, the danger of doing nothing. Now, understanding the hopes, dreams, and ambitions tell us where do we want to go as a state. And if we don't like where the trend lines are going, we can do something about it, both at the individual level and at a community level. And that, to me, is the power of this work. Data isn't destiny.
All right. Now, you divide the Economic Action Plan into two frameworks. One focuses on people and the other on places. So let's start with people and talk about the something that we have often heard about in political circles, which is the state's demographics, and how does that affect our cost of living?
It directly impacts our cost of living. So Vermont's age distribution in the year 2000, what we saw back then was a relatively large working age population compared to the number of children and the elderly. So in 2000, we had about 226,000 Vermonters between the ages of 25 to 49. That's the workforce, that's the tax base. Those are your commercial ratepayers in terms of health insurance. And in that same year, there were about 77,500 people over the age of 65. Now, if we take a look at where Vermont is now, it's a very different picture. So there are about 30,000 fewer people in that 25 to 49 category. We have a shrinking workforce, shrinking tax base, shrinking pool of commercial ratepayers and health insurance, and that's driving up costs because not only is that group smaller, but they're shouldering a larger burden. So the 65 plus population has nearly doubled in that same amount of time.
Okay, so according to these findings, what goals should we adopt to address the costs of living challenges that we have, and how can we best meet those goals?
The goals that we've set in the Economic Action Plan are twofold. So there's expansion goals and there's efficiency goals. Efficiency says, how do we do more with what we have? So how do we be more efficient with the labor force participation, increasing that to 70% by 2035. On the housing side, that's reducing the regulatory burden, the costs associated with that, and the timeline that it takes between when a proposal for housing is put forth and when shovels actually hit the ground. So those are efficiency strategies. But in addition to that, we also need expansion. We need to grow the working age population. We need to increase the overall housing stock. And we set a goal to grow Vermont's overall population to 802,000 by 2035.
Okay, so this is a little bit controversial, and I'm going to admit a bias, a personal bias that I have. One of the reasons that I moved to Vermont actually is because I had lived in places that had very high population densities before, and I wanted a place that was quieter and more rural. But the current population of Vermont is about 640,000, I think, and so you just mentioned 802,000, so that's not a huge increase. But could you speak to, try to persuade people like me?
Sure. Yeah, I'm certain that most people hear that goal and they think, wow, that's a big number in a Vermont context. And also, how did he land exactly on 800 and 2,000? Is that because of the area code? I'll explain the math behind it. So it's based on a workforce gap analysis, which I have here for folks. And this is an assessment of the workforce supply and demand. How many people are entering the workforce each year versus how many people are leaving. And the annual gap is about 13,500. That's how many people we should be adding into the workforce to close this gap. Some of that can be folks who are already here. I mentioned efficiency, but really to close that gap, we also need expansion. We need net in-migration. So when we take a look at this gap and then start to project out to 2035, 2040, that's when the numbers get in the 800,000 range. And we did pick 802 because now everyone remembers the goal and they're talking about it.
That makes sense. Great. Okay, so that's a little bit about people in the economic plan. So let's move to the second part of the framework is places, and that primarily focuses on housing, and that's definitely one of the topics that we're trying to cover in this interview series. So how does housing affect Vermont's affordability according to your findings?
Housing scarcity is what is impacting affordability in Vermont. So we have far more demand for housing than there is supply, and that wasn't always the case. So when we take a look at the data for housing over the decades in Vermont, we see Vermont has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. About a quarter of homes were built before 1940, and then we used to build at a pretty healthy rate in the 70s and 80s, but in recent decades, there's been a sharp deceleration in the amount of new housing constructed. So this scarcity that we're dealing with now, we can also address this by making it easier to build, understanding the benefits of building. And I know there's always this tension between building more housing, development, economic growth, and the potential impact on the environment in Vermont. My background is in environmental studies, and there's good research, good data to show that actually development can be part of the solution to make Vermont more sustainable. It's more of a design question than anything. Smart growth can be something that helps make Vermont more affordable and helps to protect and preserve the most precious natural resources. I often hear in my work that the goal of the Futures Project will turn Vermont into New Jersey. So I did the math, and New Jersey is about 1,200 people per square mile. Vermont's at about 70 people per square mile. And if we grow the population to 800 and 2,000, we'd go from 70 to 87 people per square mile. Vermont's population size would have to reach 11 million before we get to New Jersey level density.
Right, so we've got a long way to go to reach that, huh?
There's space.
Okay. What goals should be adopted around housing? We've had other guests come in, and there's been a lot of calculation about how many units we need to build every year and where and that sort of thing. So can you talk about what you found and how those goals could be met?
Certainly. So much of the data that your other guests have referenced are exactly what informed this plan as well in terms of the statewide housing needs assessment. What's the number of units? What is the number of units we need by 2030, by 2040? I think the important number to remember is the rate. So how many are we building annually? And right now it's about 2,500 housing units that get permitted each year, and that number needs to triple. 2,500 permitted, and I'll say that word one more time with a slightly different pronunciation. Permit, right? As in, that's how many we allow, that's how many we provide permission for. And there are so many folks I speak with around the state that say housing should be a human right. Right? Housing's a human right. If that's the case, then it should be right to build housing. It should be easy to do the right thing and provide housing for our neighbors. But whenever there's a proposal put forth, again, the timeline from when a proposal is put forth and when a house actually gets built, if it gets built, is far too long right now. We're not creating systems and structures and processes that allow us to respond appropriately to what many people call a crisis.
And what would you identify as the next steps? Again, some of my other guests have talked about that, but what are the actions that our state and our towns and cities and even individual everyday Vermonters should take to improve our situation?
Certainly. I think we need to make yes the default, and that is actually the response that I hear most often when I ask people, are they supportive of new housing? And I've asked that question at various scales. At the Vermont scale, there's generally good support. At the town scale, more than half of respondents say yes. And at the neighborhood scale, a little bit of uncertainty and opposition starts to increase with proximity. But at the same time, there are still more people that say yes than no at the neighborhood scale. So we need to empower those yes voices and start with that as the default in our community conversations about housing. And then we also need to make what might seem like an overwhelming or big number seem a little less scary. So I'm going to reframe that long-term growth goal, 802,000, or tripling the rate of housing production. To reach those long-term goals, we just need to grow at 2% per year. 2%, right? So what people can do is start to ask, what can I do in my community to support 2% growth? For a town of 1,000 people, that means welcoming 20 new residents next year, and that would take about 8 to 10 homes. That's a lot less daunting than 150,000. Right. And if we can start to think in those incremental ways at a personal scale, at a local scale, in aggregate, that will lead to transformative change.
So how is the Vermont Futures Project trying to get the word out, and how can folks at home, if they have an interest in finding out more, how would they go about doing that?
Certainly. So our website is vtfuturesproject.org. You can find a digital copy of the Economic Action Plan on the website. You can also follow our work on LinkedIn. That's where we're the most active in terms of posting updates. And I do presentations in communities all across the state. So if anyone's interested in hosting a community conversation that centers data as a starting point for envisioning what our future can be, please feel free to reach out using the contact form on the website.
Great. And I would like to just point out that it's not as if you've come in from out of state. You are a native Vermonter, right? And you graduated from Middlebury College. So sometimes I think for some folks that it gives you a little more credibility too. So I wanted to make sure I pointed that out.
That is an interesting dynamic that has come up in my work before, where I've had to establish social credibility by sharing, I am a Vermonter, I grew up here, I want to grow old here too, but it needs to be a viable place for not only me, but for future generations. My parents moved to Vermont, of all places, back in 1986. They immigrated from Southeast China, and they came to the US in search for their American dream, in search for economic opportunity. I feel really lucky they ended up here, of all places, and they were able to find that dream. They raised 3 boys, put them through college, bought a home, and neither of them had a college degree when they arrived. Neither of them spoke English. And I think about preserving that opportunity for not only Vermonters of today, but for future generations too. That's what motivates me in this work.
Yeah, that's a great story. Thank you. So I'll close by asking you the same question that we ask all of our guests, since this is a series on affordability. How would you define affordability?
Great question. So affordability certainly is a relative measure. There are some agreed upon definitions in certain contexts. For example, affordability in the housing world is often set at a 30% of your income threshold. But 30% for some people is more than others, right? And I think a good way to think about affordability is actually to put Vermont in the context of the country as a whole. And this is where we can go back to the data. The Council for Community and Economic Research looked at national data and assigned an index to each state. And Vermont ranked 8th in terms of highest cost of living in the year 2024, right? So only 7 states were more expensive, had higher cost of living. Now, when we take a look at population trends and migration trends domestically, where are people moving from and to, there's a general pattern of people moving from higher cost of living states to lower cost of living states. There were more people that moved to the state of Texas last year than the entire population of Vermont. We've seen folks move to Vermont from other states, and generally it's places that are more expensive than Vermont. And they may find Vermont to be affordable based on where they're coming from. So that's why it's a relative measure. But when we think about the future of Vermont and what affordability means here, we need to be more competitive in this national context. And fundamentally, it's a supply issue, supply of housing, supply of workforce. We need to invest in increasing supply instead of only subsidizing demand, because if we push demand up and there's not enough supply, prices go up too.
Makes sense. Great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and the information that you provided is really helpful as we examine these issues.
Thank you.
Great. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I'm Debbie Ingram, and this has been part of the Under the Dome series of Town Meeting TV. Please join us for some other conversations that we'll be having on affordability in Vermont.